Hello, this is Live with Search Engine Land. I am Ginny Marvin, Editor-in-Chief at Search Engine Land, and today we are going to be talking about CCPA and Facebook advertising and what's happening to advertisers now. And we're going to start looking ahead at all everything that's coming down the pike on the privacy side of things. And there's so much to wrap our arms around. So I'm really looking forward to a great conversation today. I encourage all of you, anyone who, if you want to ask questions, use that chat and at any point throughout the session, and we'll try to get to as many questions as you can. I am joined by two extraordinary marketers today, Akvile Defazio, who's president of AKvertise. And Akvile and I have first met actually here at Third Door Media before she left to start her own agency. And also Simon Poulton, who's VP of Intelligence at the digital agency Wpromote. Simon is an analytics whiz, and I first met him when he spoke at an SMX event. It was several years ago at this point now, he also writes for Search Engine Land, and he's been sort of a go-to resource for me when it comes to trying to understand the implications of all these various privacy measures on our campaigns, whether that's coming from what the browsers and operating systems are doing to privacy regulations like CCPA, which we're going to dive into today. So privacy and regulation is such a big topic that this is actually the second Live with Search Engine Land that we've done on CCPA related topics. And so you can find that first discussion on Search Engine Land's YouTube channel, and there's sort of a lot more background on what it is, what it means for marketers. And today we are going to focus largely on what it means for Facebook advertisers in particular, and that's because Facebook belatedly implemented its solution for CCPA compliance just last month as enforcement took effect. So caught everyone a bit off guard. But before we dive in, I'm just going to give a quick kind of down dirty explanation of what CCPA is and why we need to pay attention. So similar to the EU's General Data Regulation Protection, GDPR, the California Consumer Protection Act provides several data privacy protections, and I'll qualify this with, I am not an attorney, so please don't take what I say as your legal guidance, or anything that's said on this call is not legal guidance. So it's really about protecting data privacy for California state residents. And as we all know, California is a massive population, and so has implications for any business who's affected that is targeting California residents. So what it includes is the right to let California residents know what personal info is being collected by a business, collected, used, shared, or sold, the right to have that information deleted, and the right to opt out of having their data sold. And sold is a very broad term in this case, so it's really important to kind of wrap your head around that. Sold doesn't mean a distinct sale necessarily. So it's in the terms of selling, renting, releasing, disclosing, disseminating, making available, the list goes on, information to another entity for monetary or, and here's where our advertiser spidey sense activates, or other valuable consideration. And that's where we start to have big implications for retargeting, lookalikes, audiences like that. So, which we're going to dive into, and affected businesses, I think I'm echoing, okay, must give California residents the ability to opt out of having cookies placed on their devices. So there's an opt-out. Cookies are enabled automatically, but you have to give them an opt-out option. So quickly, who's affected? Businesses that qualify under one or more of these criteria: have a gross annual revenues, so revenues, not profits, in excess of 25 million, possess the personal information of 50,000 or more consumers, households, or devices. So that 50,000 number is not particularly huge. And so you may be affected even if you are an under 25 million gross revenue business, and or if you earn half or more than half of your annual revenue from selling consumers' personal information. All right. So that's the kind of landscape. And Simon, you wrote a great article on Search Engine Land about Facebook's attempt to help businesses that are affected be CCPA compliant. And we can talk about how Google implemented its solution back in November. Facebook thought it was exempt from this because its pixel is technically free, but as we kind of talked about, that sold has a really broad definition here. So clearly something changed. Facebook scrambled to get something out just as CCPA enforcement started, which was on July 1st. So Simon, I'd love if you could walk through what Facebook's solution, limited data use, is, and maybe give us a refresher on Google's restricted data processing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest or the most confusion that I've seen of late in terms of what do we do, how do we handle this, and even the advice that's been given out by folks online, all relates to LDU, this limited data use construct. So what essentially limited data use does is it provides a flag within the Facebook pixel. It provides the option to include this flag that will allow you to determine or to tell Facebook, hey, this individual is subject to limited data use, and therefore we will still send you the data, but we want you to process it in a CCPA compliant way. A CCPA compliant way really means we want you to not store this data. We don't want you to use it for identification purposes. We do not want you to use it in any real capacity because we've asked you to not sell it. And that, I think Ginny speaks to that ambiguity you were speaking about there. But essentially what the function allows for is you to specify, if you'd like, for a user to be automatically geo-detected by Facebook. So you can set that setting to say, yes, I'd like you to automatically detect if somebody is a California resident. That in itself is a little bit of a black box. How do you know if you're a resident? I think it's probably easy during times of COVID, challenging during the regular life that we all lead. I don't know if I'd qualify as a New York resident, but I'd probably spend about 2 months a year there, all at different times. So it becomes a little ambiguous at that point in terms of how you're actually determining that. There's also a process here that allows for a manual configuration, so you can actually say, okay, this individual, I know you may be detecting them as a California resident. I'm going to override that because perhaps their mailing address, they're a customer of ours, their mailing address is in Montana, and therefore I will call them a Montanian. The scope of how it works, of course, goes far beyond the pixel. It actually applies to all aspects of data sharing with Facebook. So it's not just in the pixel itself, but also how we think about the server-to-server connections, how we think about custom audience uploads, really any way that you're passing that data over to Facebook. As you mentioned, Ginny, the idea of Google's restricted data processing has been around since about November of last year, and as we were speaking at the very beginning, but before the meeting began, that rolled out in November in what was one of the busiest Black Friday periods we've ever seen. I think actually it may have been the biggest. So I think it did fly under the radar a little bit, but essentially that does provide the exact same function here for you to enable that. I think what's interesting about this is there are challenges from a technical implementation perspective here in terms of how this actually works. I think that's probably what we'll be talking about in a little while. But at an overarching view, I think that describes exactly how the limited data use function works and how it's being applied by Facebook.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Simon. Yeah, so in terms of implementing it, Akvile, you can talk a little bit about what this is looking like in the interface, and it's not particularly, doesn't necessarily jump out at you. So
No, not at all. It's another thing with Facebook that they don't make it as seamless as it should be or as intuitive. But so while we don't do the implementation on our end, we usually send it to our clients since we focus just on the social media ad campaign portion of our business. We just sent over the instructions to our clients. But we know that, depending on if it's a mobile app company, we have to update the SDK. If, with the Pixel, the different business tools that are available. So as we know, last month it was automatically enabled, but now we have to do that manually to be in compliant if we're within CCPA regulations. So I think Simon could probably talk more to what's involved with the implementation of it, but in terms of the other questions that we have lined up, I can definitely speak more to those.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted you to touch on it, Akvile, because you would think that with this, as an advertiser, you would log into the interface and see limited data use. There's sort of a banner, but it is not a massive call to action. So
no, not at all.
If you are affected at all, you kind of need to hunt this down. So yeah, Simon, if you want to talk about what it looks like, where it is, and what the options are today.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good point, right? Because the options have changed. So if you logged into your Facebook Business Manager on the 1st of July, you would see a very different view than what you see right now. I think Akvile brings up a very good point there in terms of this transition window. There was an automatically applied transition window by Facebook that went from July 1st to July 31st. What that window did is this just automatically enabled limited data use for everyone in California, which is quite damning. It's quite honestly the greatest amount of overreach I think I've ever seen from a platform in terms of what they're doing. It's actively hurting themselves in terms of revenue. But really what's happening is a lot of advertisers are seeing a huge dip because of it. So essentially it kills off all remarketing within California. And then also it actually occludes the passback signal. So you're losing the signal at the point of conversion. So even if you can market to people in California, of course you can still do prospecting. You can prospect to them, but the signals you get back will be next to zero conversions. A couple sneak through because of a few different technical classifications, but that really was what was happening. So Facebook was telling folks, we need you to implement this flag. But where do you implement the flag? If you implement this on every single page within the pixel by default, that's no different from having this toggled on in the platform, right? So essentially what you're doing is just killing your remarketing, you're killing your performance across the board and making it very difficult. So what you need to do is actually enable that LDU flag only when a user has opted out. So this gets complicated. What does an opt-out look like? So if you've got a section on your site, hopefully you do. If you are required to be CCPA compliant, you should have a do not sell my information little button at the bottom. Hopefully it's available from all pages wherever somebody comes to your site. It should be there right alongside your privacy policy. If somebody clicks through on that, you need to provide them an option to opt out. Now, the option to opt out here, I've seen all kinds of different ways that this has been implemented. Some folks are using tools like OneTrust, where they have a form that's automating this process, and the user types their information in and says, here's my info, sends it over to Facebook. Oh, sorry, sends it to the advertiser's backend, the brand's backend, and they go, okay, yep, we'll record that, and we will not be sharing your information out. But then others also just seem to have a very basic approach to this. They'll just have email us if you don't want us to sell your information, which I think works at very small scale. But if this starts to take off and you start getting 5,000 requests, that's a lot to process. It's also a lot to maintain on the back end in terms of actually maintaining that knowledge of these individuals have opted out. We need to respect that. Another piece that you brought up earlier was also cookies and cookie management. And that creates a rub here. Because when you think about the implementation of this saying, okay, users opted out, they filled out the form, we will now enable LDU, right? So that's a value you want to store in the cookie on that individual. You store that so you can persist it across their journey when they leave the site, come back, of course, anything like that. The challenge here, though, comes from the idea that what if I also disable cookies? Because if you disable cookies at that point in time, it means I can't store that value. Now, there is a way to store it. You can use what's called local storage. Local storage is, it's been around for a very long time. We're all very aware of it. But it's also sort of Don't store things in there. That's kind of a sacred place for on-site functions more than anything, which I think this is. And I think the spirit of CCPA is one that you do want to be able to persist a user's choice. So what this means is that if somebody opts out of the cookies, it's essentially the same effect as applying LDU, right? You're just not sharing that information with Facebook. If the Facebook pixel does not have access to the cookie, it cannot load on your identity. It cannot pass that back. And so what has to happen is if you do have a function that disables cookies, you need to store the LDU flag in local storage and persist that with the user. That's incredibly technically complicated. We have some really smart developers working on this, and they've found that complicated with clients. What we have found as a sort of a happy middle ground is just to simply enable LDU to fire whenever somebody clicks "Do not sell my information." That is being the easiest path of this. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to tell you this is the compliant way to do it. It's slightly overkill, but it is a great way to do it and persist that value for those individuals. So you really do want to make sure that you can respect the user's choice in this regard, and make sure that you're able to mitigate their information either being passed to Facebook or Google or other platforms as well, because the user doesn't have any other way to let you know. And I think a big part of the problem here is you can fill out that form, that's great, but IP address counts as personal information. That is a nightmare. I'm working at home right now, but my wife and I, we share an IP address right now. That's really interesting. I could opt out of something, and does that have to apply to her as well? So there's a lot of complexity going on there, but it's also why I would recommend that if you do have a form on site, that you do store a user's IP address as a hidden field. You want to be able to bring that through and make sure that that's also being included from being passed through. And that's obviously what LDU is doing here. It's saying we don't want to send the IP over either, and just ensuring that that works. In the article that I wrote on Search Engine Land earlier this month, it does go into how to do this, what it looks like. Quite honestly, Facebook's documentation on this is terrible. If you go to their page, it makes it seem like it's just some random option. If you go to the regular Pixel implementation page, it doesn't say anything about it. You actually have to go into the Pixel itself and see your options in there of either in transition period or maintain transition period, which doesn't exist anymore, right? It's a dead field that would have ended on July 31st, or persisted until October 20th. Again, that's at a batch level. So I'd highly recommend taking the approach of going into your site, finding where should this flag fire on individuals so you don't fire it on everyone, and then using the automated option for Facebook to be able to identify a user that is a California resident. That is a really key component to this as well. If you use the secondary option, the specify users and specify for users and user geography, they're going to rely on you to provide that field, and that may not be clear at all times. If you don't have a value in there, well, that means nothing processes. So you want to make the choice that way.
In the meantime, though, so if people are thinking, I don't know, I think CCPA applies to me, I don't have time to get my developer looped in right now, I want to make sure that we're protected. They go into Events Manager and enable to have LDU enabled through October 20th.
That is correct. So that is the most overkill, the most broad way that you could possibly do this is to enable it through October 20th. But all those caveats that I put out at the top there. So if you're seeing performance is tanking, especially if the bulk of your customers are in California, it's something you want to try and act on very quickly. And I know it's one of those things where they'll say, well, we'll get to it. You know, we're working on these other things right now. This isn't something you should put on the back burner. It's not something that you should wait until October to handle. It's definitely something you should try and handle now. And make this an organizational priority. Honestly, make a calculation around how much money this is costing you, because it's highly likely that it's having an impact behind the scenes that you're not even initially aware of if you don't have the campaign structures to really see that.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I can add just to that, if somebody wants to see an example in the wild of what that looks like on the website, Taco Bell's homepage, they have that link at the bottom with a form that you can go to and just check out. I'm not a lawyer as well. You may want to talk to your legal team, but that's a good example if you just want to check it out.
I'll just jump on that and also say that Target has a phenomenal user experience there. They also support the Utah privacy law in terms of opt-out functions. So they seem to be way ahead of the game. They've been doing this since before 2020 even.
Great, thanks for those. And so I guess this brings us to, so we've talked about sort of the complexities of how to implement it. Again, though, if you are having any questions at all, the the default way to stay compliant and then loop back with your IT dev team later is to, in Events Manager, in Facebook Ads Manager, there is the option to automatically extend limited data use through October 20th. So then that's sort of this blanket statement that will keep you compliant through that period of time. So when Facebook first launched this, it was on by default for everyone through the 31st of July, and then that lifted. So if you have not taken any action, you are not covered by limited data use. So that, I hope, kind of clears up what the current state of things is. So I want to talk about sort of what the implications are actually looking like for advertisers now that CCPA is in effect and LDU took effect. It's true for everyone all of July, unless the advertisers have taken action. So Akvile, do you want to kind of talk about some of the things that you've been seeing in accounts?
Sure, it's been interesting to see the different types of clients that we're working with in the accounts, but clients that did enable LD, we saw a decrease in performance last month and significantly. So I suspect that occurred because there's a decrease in competition in the auction when it came to California residents, but also a lot of other major brands did, there's the whole boycott coming along. So there was a mixture of things impacting performance last month, but compared to June, we did see an uptick in performance for a lot of campaigns, but now we've been seeing it trending downward, which I think more clients and companies are implementing that. And it's interesting to see the variation in the competition that's taking place. So, it's a very suspect time for them to launch this with, the fall season and the holiday season coming up, but it'd be nice if we got a little bit more leeway, but it's nice that, there's extension through October. But primarily we're just seeing that. We're trying to strategize through other states how we can drive more business. But later we'll touch on some other states that are considering similar legislation. So I think we might see a similar thing to GDPR across the US, but I imagine it's going to take quite a while because each state has different variations of their consumer privacy laws. But just keep a close eye on it and see how it's affecting you. But one thing I wanted to add with retargeting campaigns that, even if you have LDU enabled, we did find a small workaround that's still kind of working temporarily for pixel-based retargeting audiences that if, even if you do take cookies off your site, we've noticed that if we target just California and people that have previously engaged with the Facebook post or ad or Instagram post or ad, we're still seeing conversions come in through those. So that just might be another way that you can maybe regain some of those users back into your campaigns, at least to some extent in the meantime.
Yeah, which is interesting. I mean, that seems kind of like almost a leak in Facebook's bathtub here, right? In terms of what's happening. Like, I think the one worry I would have is still sort of like the buck has been passed from Facebook to the advertisers, and that, what I think Facebook's done here basically is it's like you're in school and there was some homework that was due and most of your friends did it the night before and you just turn up to class and they're like, by the way, homework's due in 10 minutes. And you're like, oh, and you're just sitting at the back there scribbling the answers and go, here you go, I did the homework. And that's kind of what Facebook's done with us because there's no wiggle room on this, right? That's why they were so heavy-handed on this is what we're doing. And it is very challenging. I do think there was a big early mover advantage though that we saw on this. So for the clients that we had that did shift, that enabled LDU in the most minimal capacity, right? Only when somebody opts out. When they opted, when the clients who did that on either July 1st or July 2nd, they saw just a much better overall CPAs decreased. Their remarketing reach actually increased. So there was this window there for about 2 to 3 weeks where it's like, yeah, the Facebook is your oyster. And as someone who's I live in California, I live in Los Angeles. My Facebook feed has been bizarre. All of July, I was getting the worst ads, all kinds of things where I was like, I have no interest in this. And I was like, it's because they basically stripped all the personalization settings out of this. Like even with some of the prospecting, it wasn't meeting the mark. So I think it's been very interesting to see that. And now we're sort of seeing that pendulum shift back. And I'm starting to see a lot more retargeting ads. But I don't think these brands know that they are non-compliant. I think there's a huge gap out there, not just with LDU, but the fact that LDU seems to be starting the conversation around should I be CCPA compliant? Does this apply to me? Greg Sterling wrote a great article on Search Engine Land basically saying it pretty much applies to everyone. Even if you don't think it does, think about how you take proactive measures to make it work and try and get there. I know it's complicated, I know it's hard, but there are ways you can do it that are very simplistic, like firing it on the privacy policy page, just making it simple like that. You still need a developer, but it's not nearly as intense as what I'm talking about with persisting cookie states, which absolutely is going to require an analytics developer.
Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, I think that the people that were ready for GDPR, I mean, it's a little bit easier to wrap your arms around the CCPA updates, and I do think it kind of goes to everything's going to start moving in this direction, and the sooner you and your teams really dive in and understand how these systems work, what the regulations are, how they're working, the ambiguities behind them, and what implementing the restrictions is actually going to mean for your data and for your results. I think the sooner you do this, the better you're going to be prepared for things coming down the road, which we are going to talk about some of the other initiatives that are having at the state level. And of course, there's constant discussion about a federal initiative. Who knows if that will ever actually come together, but it's certainly in the ethos, at least. So one thing. Yeah, go ahead, Simon.
Sorry, Ginny, I just wanted to add one thought here, and that was about GDPR, right? Folks who are ready for GDPR, maybe not ready for CCPA. It's very interesting. I asked the Facebook team about this specifically, and I was basically saying, well, you know, you've got LDU for California. What did you have for GDPR? And they were saying, well, we didn't have anything for GDPR because it's different. GDPR is an opt-in function versus this being opt-out, which is better for us, but it's also that much more complicated. So the beauty of having an opt-in scenario is, hey, only 1% of people are going to opt in anyway, so you don't have to worry about too much. You just have to have that cookie control. But with this scenario, it's how do we bring back that 95% that have not opted out that I can still market to and engage appropriately?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Very good point. Okay, so we've kind of talked about, I've seen people that are saying, okay, we're going to break out our California campaigns separately, target those users in a way that we can understand what's happening. So adjusting goals, you know, kind of where are we seeing in terms of how should you be either restructuring or whatever steps you're taking kind of accommodate CCPA and what LDU looks like in your campaign structure. So, Akvile, do you want to, is that something you want to talk to?
So we've been breaking out California into separate campaigns. If it works, if you're using CBO and you want to break out separate ad sets, as long as the audiences are still about the same size, then go for that. But we just find it easier to get better visibility and ease of management and optimization to see what's really happening with these new campaigns. Since all these changes are very new, we don't know what it's going to look like in Q3, Q4, and to what extent. So I don't think it would hurt to break those out in the interim just to see what happens. And so then that way, if anything does fluctuate, it's not going to impact your campaigns as a whole and maybe cause performance to go down everywhere and affect your costs. So, you know, at our agency, we're breaking them out. But for the purpose of today, I didn't want to just talk about what we're doing. So I ran a Twitter and a private Facebook group that I'm in, and I ran a poll to see if people are breaking this out just to get more context and data from that. But it seems like about 60% of responses were that they are breaking it out. So you just may want to consider that for your own campaigns. And you mentioned talking about adjusting your goals and expectations. So if you are implementing LDU and you see performance taking a dip, just prepare for that and strategize how you can boost performance maybe in other states, other locations. You know, I imagine most people will not opt out, so we may be safe to an extent, but just, you know, have a backup plan in place just so your business doesn't see a tremendous dip. And then if your business doesn't meet CCPA criteria, enable LDU going forward, you may see improved performance at reduced cost, and we are seeing that currently. I know it's only been 1 week into August, but we're seeing a little dip compared to July already, but it's not as significant as it was in Q1 and Q2 earlier this year. And then if your business eventually meets the CCPA criteria, I think it'll be your responsibility just to be aware of what's going on, what changes are there, and to modify your business tools within Facebook just to remain compliant. And yeah, that's all I got for that.
And I think you made a really good point there on just the nature of how the nature of targeting and sort of the feedback loops there. Some of them, you can still be marketing here, but the feedback loop just might not exist, but there's still potential in California. And I think that there's still reason to be marketing to folks in California. It's not just because you can't report on them, that doesn't mean that you're actually not converting and engaging these individuals. So I think part of it is there's a structure with these campaigns that you want to change, but you also, to some degree, would probably want to look at Google Analytics and say, okay, well, yeah, let's look at some of our click-based conversions, because at this point in time, we can at least start to get some degree of understanding of what's happening here. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like when they made the not provided keywords change in Google, we all just sort of used this moment in time to say, okay, well, we've got some insights from what it was before. We can kind of bring that forward a little bit. I think that there's some degree of just understanding that at an overarching level, you're still going to see performance in California, just not in your remarketing campaigns using custom audiences.
Just on that remarketing front with the engagement, the post and organic engagement audiences that you can build out, we're still seeing performance in those because clicks are technically considered a form of engagement. So chances are you'll still hit maybe a large percentage of people that engage with prior ads or posts, and you can retarget to them. That
is, I think, the best workaround to it. If you've got to have it enabled, that's the way to go for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and so I'm just thinking with Google's restricted data processing, so that retargeting or remarketing in Google speak lists are not available. Similar audience seed lists are not available. So we've talked about the remarketing or retargeting implications. What about the lookalike implications for California audiences as well?
So for those, we're still running them, but we're taking the engagement list and then creating lookalikes off of those. They're still performing to an extent, not as powerfully as they were at the end of 2019, but it's something in the interim while we continue strategizing with various clients.
And I think lookalikes are interesting, right? Because it's not like, there's so many facets to what goes into the creation of a lookalike audience. So just because somebody's not in California doesn't mean there aren't people just like me in Texas. And so using those types of audiences too, but then targeting into California, there is a path there, and having some insight into how that's working. I certainly think that there's some persistence there, but I would hope that there's a future state where folks do have at least some degree of LDU enabled on site so they can get back to using these lookalike audiences, because there's so much value in having that, and you don't need to have massive seed lists to go after them. In theory, you could have half of your Californian folks opt out. That's not going to happen, by the way. Anecdotally, we have one client, a nationwide client, that had, I think, 2 million sessions in the month of June, and they had 800 people opt out. So to put that in perspective, no one is opting out. Californians in general, I ask people frequently that, my friends and so forth, like, what do you think about CCPA? And they have no idea what I'm talking about. It is completely confusing. No one knows the California rights that they have.
I was going to add one more thing to that if you want to create other custom audiences, one thing we've certainly worked well with just other scenarios in the past is creating dummy UTMs. So just like a fake UTM parameter and append that to your ads. So we will know who we're targeting in a particular ad set. So maybe somebody in California that is interested in computers or marketing, and then we'll add that dummy UTM, and anyone that clicks that ad, we'll create an audience out of them and then use that as a lookalike, and that's worked out well for us. So that might be something else you might want to consider to reach and then retarget to California users that haven't opted out, of course.
Great. Okay. And I guess you can still see data in your CRM, right? If you're trying to reconcile the actual, if you lose visibility on these folks in Facebook ads, you may have some visibility in GA, but you certainly you're not losing the actual transaction data, or obviously transactions themselves in your CRM, right? That's still there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think it depends on the type of business that you have, of course, right? Like an e-commerce business, of course, they're going to get shipping addresses. They're going to get that address every time. If you are maybe a lead gen business, perhaps the geolocation does need to be inferred. So I think there is value certainly in recording or finding some degree of geolocation function that you can have that records that on forms as an inferred field. That would be a good path to this. When we talk about CRM, I think there's a very interesting piece of this too that I do want to bring up, and it's the idea of CDPs, customer data platforms, and the role that they play with CCPA, because that is such an important piece of this. Is when somebody opts out, you do want to have a CDP or a CRM where there is a partition of these individuals that you are segmenting out as well. So if you haven't been investing in your CRM or CDP capabilities, this is honestly there's no better time than now. I think the 2021 is of course we're seeing the rise of the CDP for some time now, but I think CDP is probably going to be one of the #1 places that MarTech investment is going to go next year because of how much we need to rely on owning the customer data and experience, and not necessarily relying on being able to push that to other platforms with other IDs that perhaps are anonymous or just not valid fields within a CRM, for instance.
In addition to that, just as a backup, if you want to export those and just have them as an exclusion audience in all of your campaigns that you're running in California, that could just protect you an extra amount.
So I totally agree, but it's interesting because that is where I look at it and go, is this legal? Is the fact that somebody said, I'm opting out, I don't want you to sell my information to Facebook, and we're saying, well, we're still going to share it to them, but we're sharing it to them so they don't use it. And it's a hard one for me, and I'm not a lawyer, but for me it comes down to spirit of compliance, and I do think that is absolutely in the spirit of compliance, but it's also in this gray area of, should I not stop utilizing that data the second you tell me to stop using it? I think in the strictest letter of the law, absolutely you should, but it's a broader challenge. And I think this is where privacy and tech limitations sort of hit this head point where they both make each other very hard to operate with in terms of how we handle exclusions, because Facebook's just algorithms, right? It's not a human sitting there going, aha, logically this is how I should do this. So we do have to feed those algorithms and tell them stop picking up these people they have opted out.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, and there's the people who have opted out and the people who have requested to have their information deleted. So you lose them entirely. So that's a whole other, and I think that brings the CDP value into place to remember that you deleted them. I mean, there's all the technology challenges and the importance of really understanding this. Your customer data is going to be more and more important for CCPA, but also with everything else that's happening on the privacy front, from browsers to operating systems. And we could spend 3 more hours going over everything that is happening on that front. And we will continue to have conversations on that in Live with Search Engine Land, just not today. But there's certainly, I think, Simon, you're right in terms of really taking the time now for companies really to focus on what that customer data flow looks like, what the storage looks like, and how your what your storage looks like, and being able to communicate with all the other channels that you're using. So I get that kind of comes up to has this changed any of the conversations you've been having with either your clients, different teams in the clients, Akvile, or cross-functional dialogues that should be happening internally or between agencies and clients?
Yes, it has impacted that. We've had an uptick in communications between our clients and their teams, just making sure that we are in compliance if we qualify for these different updates that are necessary. So there's been a lot of education, through what we're doing and through what our clients are doing, and just we're having an open line of communication as, things keep rolling out.
Yeah, and I'd say in a similar vein, I don't think I've told this many people to consult with a lawyer in my life. I never thought I'd be in a position where I would have to just constantly say, you need to speak with a lawyer right now. But that is what needs to happen. I think there's a lot of organizations that are just not prepared for this, that don't know what the requirements are, that don't know if they even apply to them. This idea of 50,000 records is so ambiguous. And then the nature of opt-out is so ambiguous, right? Like, we know that there's all these tools online. If you go to a lot of privacy policies, they'll have things in them like, go to your web privacy choices and you can change these things on these websites. But that doesn't change everything. And there's also different degrees of opt-out, right? Like opting out within the Facebook UI, well, that just pertains to Facebook. It doesn't pertain to the advertisers sharing with Facebook. So there's so much complexity that makes it so hard to be compliant that honestly, I'm very fearful of what it looks like if other states do not adopt the same standard as CCPA from a compliance point of view. And it's not because people don't care, it's simply because it's going to be a nightmare to handle it.
Yeah, well, and actually, why don't we touch on we've got Maine and Nevada, and you want to, I know, Akvile, you've been looking, I mean, I am from Maine. I will tell you, no one has any idea what's happening, much like Californians. So Maine's is much more limited to broadband ISPs, but Akvile, if you want to kind of share sort of what you've been focusing on in these areas, it'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So just a little background. Maine passed the LD 946 law, not as easy as the CCPA, but it does require ISPs, as you said, to obtain customer consent before using, disclosing, selling, permitting access to data to third parties. So this law went into effect July 1st, just last month. However, we've looked at all of our client accounts and just did a month-to-month comparison, but we haven't seen any effects in either direction towards Maine targeted campaigns. I'm just curious, Ginny, have you seen any effects, any different types of ads running through your feeds? No, not yet. Okay. So I suspect that's because it's not as strict as the California one, but Nevada has a few more. So they passed a similar piece of legislation called SB 220, which seems to have gone a little bit more under the radar. I think California kind of took the news and everybody by surprise earlier this year, but Nevada's law went into effect actually October 1st of last year. So their law applies to personally identifiable information such as your name, phone number, email address, social security. But there are also a lot of businesses that are exempt from that law, such as certain financial institutions, organizations that are subject to HIPAA laws, motor vehicle manufacturers, and third parties that host or manage websites or online services on behalf of its owners. So while we ran some reports as well for Nevada targeted campaigns and no effects there in either direction, but I think that's attributed to Nevada and Maine's laws being a little bit more limited in the scope compared to CCPA. But the interesting thing, it'll be interesting to see how California and other states, if we violate the law, how they're going to implement it. But I did see that Nevada will fine you up to $5,000 per violation. But what exactly is a violation? I couldn't find just how they're going to find that, who's going to reach out to you, and how you will be, how that might be enforced.
Yeah, and my understanding on the CCPA side, from the violation standpoint, is for each, it could conceivably be for each record. So
that's the scary part, right? It adds up.
Yeah, could, yes. But again, consult your lawyer, because don't take risks.
One more thing about other states, if I might. There are, since we have 3 states now, and I think you mentioned Utah earlier, but we can expect that these might pass through other states as well. So just as a heads up, Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New Mexico, North Dakota, Texas, and Washington are considering similar laws or have in the recent months. So it may become the new normal, and we'll just have to keep an eye out for it. But, start talking to your teams, your clients, and thinking of ways of, just looking at what's going on in California and what you might have to implement within your own websites and operations.
Yeah, and Brian Huber has a question about whether we should expect a U.S. national privacy law in the future, or if this is going to be driven state by state. I mean, there is certainly industry push for a federal blanket regulation so that marketers and platforms and the entire ecosystem isn't trying to navigate this patchwork. But the reality of that actually happening at this point is, we're relying on federal government to make big decisions, and that we all know is a challenge. So I think it's certainly in discussion, the actual, what that actually ends up looking like and what kind of timeline, I think is up to, nobody has any idea. And so at this point, that's why the states are just taking this in their own arms and running with it. So, I think to Akvile's point, marketers at this point really need to be expecting to have to navigate this patchwork. And I assume that more advertisers will also be joining the advocation for a federal law. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, Simon.
That would make it much easier, right?
Yeah.
It would. So I've got two thoughts on this, and one of them is a bit of a wild theory. But the theory is that the nature of the way Facebook has created the limited data use flag has a number in it that pertains to California. So California's number is 1,000. That is the number you put in if you want to manually define the state of residency. That leaves a lot of ambiguity, right? Because there's a lot of other numbers that can exist, of course. But my thought is that they're going to have, say, different numbers, say 500, that could pertain to Utah. And that would then follow different data processing restrictions if those are enforced. So I think that Facebook's taking an approach that says there's going to need to be flexibility. What I hope happens, though, is that more states do follow CCPA, that we look at that as the baseline standard. I do worry about the nature of that, though, because I think it's something that can very easily be politicized. And what we may start to see is, well, I'm not following the California law. I'm going to follow, like maybe Texas comes up with one. Who knows what that future looks like? What I would say is I think we're a long way from an actual federal regulation on this, and we will see more of a patchwork before we see the amalgamation of all of them coming together in one federal law.
Yeah. So Tyler Ward had a question about fleshing out a bit more about the differences between GDPR's opt-in versus CCPA's opt-out and the impact each has on advertisers. So, Simon, you mentioned that you have the client now that has seen 800 customers opt out. That was quite different from a GDPR opt-in perspective. So I don't know if you want to touch on that, either Simon or Akvile.
So I think it's as simple as like let's say that there's a car. Are you inside the car or are you outside the car? In one scenario, you have to opt to get out. In one, you're already outside of it, right? And then that's basically GDPR. GDPR, you're already outside of it. You can get in the car if you want, but you don't have to. There's nothing on you, which means that 2 million people in that scenario, right? They're already outside. So that means all of the things that we think about when it comes to cookie tracking, when it comes to the ability to handle remarketing, can't do it. It's not possible for them. The complete flip side is that in CCPA, everyone is in the car already. We can market to all of them, but if they say I'm getting out, we have to respect that and we have to leave them there.
Yeah, great analogy. All right, and we have another question from Daniel Hernandez. How does CCPA impact other vendors like Google Analytics? Are advertisers at legal risk if they work with vendors who don't have similar opt-out features? This is a great question. Or is that legal risk on the vendors receiving PII from opted out users? I will, again, caveat that none of us are attorneys, and please consult your legal advisors. But you should make sure that your vendors are in compliance because these are your users. And so regardless of the law, I would say that. So again, consult your legal advisors, but think of these people as your potential customers. You're the company that is interfacing with them, not Google Analytics, not your DSP, it's you. And so think of that relationship and how you want to be represented in respecting their rights. I don't know.
No, I'd say that's exactly right. I think that we will see other platforms come out with additional functions that allow for, especially IP occlusion, because I think that is sort of this like middle ground, this gray area. But right now it is just this Google and Facebook. So when we talk about Google Analytics, well, the opt-out scenario there is you literally opt out of cookie tracking. You opt out of tracking. So that needs to be a scenario that you do have available on site. It gets ambiguous here, though, because what is personal information? And that's the rabbit hole I think we'll go down in terms of if you're using an IP to determine anything about a user, but that's transformed into a different field. what does that mean? I don't know what that means. Maybe a lawyer could chime in on that. But those are not default fields that are held by Google Analytics. So the nature of passing that data in there is one where we are looking at client ID, which is stitched together through a few different identifiers. Those identifiers, though, could definitely fall under PPI. The challenge, I think, with a lot of this comes down to the fact that this law was written by legislators and not technical practitioners. And inevitably, just like when we originally were talking about GDPR, they talked about, yeah, you've got to have the ability to opt out of cookies. So everyone said, well, we're going to use maids then. And you're like, well, that's kind of semantics at that point. I know they're different in function. I know they operate in different ways, but the spirit of the law should be something that you apply. And I think if brands take the initiative and say, I need to have an opt-out function on my site, that's going to protect you 99% of the time, right? That you really need to adhere to the spirit. There'll be some leaks. There'll be some strange things that get worked out. CCPA is not the end of the road, though. There's another ballot in California coming up at the end of the year in our November election that's going to get voted on, which is going to stabilize this, and then they're going to enhance it. So this is not where it ends. Honestly, this is where it begins. And I think Akvile made a great point earlier saying we might see a GDPR style scenario roll out in the United States in the coming years. CCPA will be the foundation for that, and it will grow from here.
Yeah, I do think it's really interesting, and I do think, to both of your points, that this is the beginning. And so, get your legal team tuned in, get your developer team tuned in, and really carve out a strategic team that probably is going to be tasked with this on a long-term basis. And so that should, that team that you pull together should encompass all the different areas that are stakeholders are going to be affected internally and externally. Go ahead, Simon.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, it's funny because it's kind of like when social media, when brands started getting into social media, and you're like, who's doing the social? And you're like, the intern is. And everyone's like, great. And that's sort of what I'm seeing with these compliance teams right now. It's like, who's handling your compliance? Oh, that's what the front desk person works on now that we're all at home during COVID. And I'm sitting there going, that's not a long-term plan. Like you're asking them to take all of your company's responsibility into their hands. They don't know what they're doing, and you're gonna be shocked when they screw it up. Like that is not a scalable scenario. So absolutely build a compliance team, have legal representation and technical representation, as well as your overarching business, because it's not just digital. It is all these touch points that we think about. All this information can be shared in so many different ways. This is just the tip of the Facebook iceberg that we're talking about today.
Yep, great point. Before we wrap up, this whole thing it's complex. It sounds a little doom and gloom, but the IAB, which is comprised of all the big ad tech firms. So this is they just published the 2020 State of Programmatic report. And so I'm just going to share this paragraph because I thought it was interesting, and maybe will give all of us a little bit of sense of optimism through this. So he said, while there were concerns that regulations, specifically around GDPR at this point, would negatively impact consumer trust of brands and limit brand profitability, those concerns have largely been unfounded. In fact, an unexpected benefit of regulations is that brands are now working with cleaner data. And while regulations have culled down the number of customers who can be targeted, those that remain are more relevant and interested, resulting in more effective ad spend. So that's sort of this best case scenario. Everything's going to be cleaner, more efficient, more effective. There are absolutely going to be bumps in the road on this, but the fact that the IAB said that, I felt like gives us a little bit of something to hold on to.
Businesses need advertising, so we'll stick around.
Yeah, I mean, it does, but I also wonder, like, is this them literally marketing this thing going, yeah, the glass is half full, folks? And we're like, no, it's definitely half empty, and it is, more milk continues to fall out of it. I agree with the sentiment of what they're saying, but it's the same idea of, well, if you fix your email list and you get rid of all your inactives, your open rate is going to be so great. And you're like, yeah, but an open rate with 10 people is still like, I wouldn't care if I had 100%, still 10 people.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's like Google introducing a new conversion mechanism and then saying, it's amazing, conversions went up. You can count store visits, conversions, all your conversions went up. Oh.
Smart conversions for sure. Yeah, I think I had like a 70% smart conversion rate at one point. I'm like, what does that even mean? 70% of people they came to my website, 30% were bots. I don't know.
All right, that's a good point. Well, Simon, count on Simon to rain on the parade. No, I'm kidding.
No, I truly believe in the future of where we're going with privacy, right? I think it's very important. I think that we as marketers have taken advantage of just the general public for far too long. We see it in like the ITP as a response to do not track signals, right? We've taken advantage of consumers, and I think we all need to be very, very serious about this. And hey, it's great that we message it this way, but I do think that we also need to have an understanding of this is a real impact on businesses, and we do have to find alternative methods to reach these audiences in a compliant way, and always look for consent.
Yeah. Any final words, Akvile?
Just keep your eye on, or keep your hand on the pulse and see where it goes next, and just prepare for the future. And I think we can definitely expect some other legislation coming through, and don't give up hope.
Yeah.
Be an advocate, right? Like, I think get involved in these conversations. I think if something is happening in your state, get involved in it, because it's the people who join calls like this. You're the ones who are that interested and invested in it, in the future of what this looks like. And we want to create a really good society, not just for us and for the public, but also for continued monetization of publishing and making sure that we still have a free and open internet. I think those are really key components of this, and making sure that they don't swing the pendulum too far in any one direction.
Great. All right, we will end with that. Thank you all so much for joining us. Next week, we are going to have a editor's recap of all things that we have been discussing over the last 25 weeks since we've started Private Search Engine Land. We have had a massive focus, obviously, on the fallout and effect on marketers' businesses in the pandemic. And so we are going to be talking about what that has looked like, how we've seen businesses adapt, and how we see things going forward. So I hope you'll join us next Friday, same time, 1 p.m. ET. And thank you so much, Simon and Akvile.
Thank you, Ginny.
Thank you.
Bye.